welcome back to the Healthtech Podcast, brought to you by SomX, and we break down the health tech news every single week. And you might have heard my voice for a while. My name's Jessica, and I am co-founder here at SomX. I have been gallivanting off for quite a few weeks, but myself and both James are back at the mics with our producer Adama and editor, Healthtech Pigeon editor Hugh. Welcome back, everybody. James, how does it feel to be back?
Yeah, how does it feel to be back at work after 2 weeks in the Seychelles? And another 2 weeks in the south
married.
of France. Getting married, yeah, for a honeymoon. Wonderful, yeah, fantastic. Delighted, of course, to be back. No, Seychelles was good. It was good to get a break. It was good to... the thing is that when you take time off, like, you end up getting loads of ideas and things that we can do, and it does make you remember, like, when you get to the end of like a month off, like, you do want to make something of your time and your life and do things that are important. So yeah, I had loads of ideas of like different stuff that we can do, and yeah, a million different business ideas that I'll never do. And yeah, glad to be back to put at least some of that into practice.
Nice. And for listeners' benefit, Adam and Hugh have their head in their hands thinking, oh, they're back meddling with things again. What are they going to come out with? Can they even remember what health tech is after all of this time off? But Hugh, how have you been? I feel like we haven't caught up since we've been back anyway. So how have you been?
We haven't. This is, I think, our first meeting podcast since you got back. No, we've been really good. Pigeon has, I guess, survived without you both, but we've missed you, and Jen, particularly your unique brand of cynical optimism for this podcast.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's not been enough just random disagreement on this podcast. That's a lie. I heard you've done a fantastic job of that in your absence. But
fantastic.
happy to have you back no matter what.
Excellent.
Well, speaking of cynical musings from James, I think it's probably about time that we jump into our first story. This story comes to us from Forbes, and the headline is "Lying to your therapist is being superseded by telling the truth to generative AI." Bold statement. So, yeah, James.
This is interesting. So this is an exploration of like basically what's better, going to a human therapist for therapy or getting it done by generative AI. That's quite a reductive summary of what this article is. It's actually enormous, this article, and it's really, really, really good and really interesting because it goes through all about how humans lie to therapists and why human therapy is therefore less effective as a result, and gives a relatively persuasive argument at times about generative AI being a genuine alternative. Now, it's not saying that either is perfect. It's not saying that generative AI should absolutely be used. But recently but for people that follow my content and came to my talk at that one I did recently at Digital Healthcare Show, I've been thinking about AI and where we're going in healthcare, and the fact that AI is used everywhere in healthcare, and we're trying to use AI literally everywhere in healthcare. And I guess what I've been saying in my content in the talk was, just because everywhere could have AI, should it? And I've been exploring what are the places where we absolutely don't want AI. Where shouldn't we be putting AI? And one of those places was at the point of human suffering alone. And talking therapies are a very good example of this. Therapy, psychological, psychiatric at times therapy is a great example of that. Where I was sort of saying that there's absolutely no way that I think that should be the case, and outlined a load of arguments for it. Now, there's been a few things that have happened since then, because obviously you start seeing a lot of the same thing when you've been talking about it, and I've started to see quite a lot of arguments that might make that not as true as when I said it, or at least me thinking it's not as as true as when I said it. Now, one of those is what they talk about in this article, which is the fact that human beings lie, and they lie more to humans, and they lie less to generative AI. I am actually an example of this, and this is something that I talked about. I actually put it in my talk about I used Woebot when I was trying to prop up my own mental health, and I was radically honest with Woebot in a way that I would never have been to a human. And as a result, Woebot knew what my problem was and then gave me tools and techniques in order to solve it. I'm not actually sure I would have done it the same with a human, but I would have expected a human to tease that out of me. I would have expected a human to understand the nuance and use their skill to get that out of me. Now, what this article is saying is that there are so many different ways that human beings will lie to therapists. They lie to pretend that they find their therapist useful. They lie to indicate therapy is effective when they don't believe it is. They lie to hide their personal feelings toward the therapist. They lie about secretly wanting to end their therapy. They lie to avoid recalling uncomfortable matters that are distressful. There's literally 14 of these different ways that people lie to therapy. And it suggests that people don't do the same to generative AI. Now, the interesting thing about this for me is that when I was reflecting on this and thinking, well, what is the answer here? The answer is I don't know. And the answer is a blend. And I think the answer is somewhere. It's obviously going to be somewhere in the middle. And it's similar to when telemedicine came out and everyone was like, oh my God, this is terrible. I actually listened back to the podcast I did with Keith Grimes on the Healthtech Podcast about this. And he makes a really interesting point there. He was booed off the stage at the Royal Society of Medicine when telemedicine was coming in and he was evangelizing it. Can you imagine that in healthcare, in healthtech, being booed, roundly booed, he said, at the Royal Society of Medicine for talking about telemedicine. People threatening to send him to the GMC because they just didn't believe that telemedicine was ethical. And look at us now. The truth is it has a place. We've just defined exactly where it should be used. Yes, you can't examine. Yes, you can't do these things, but it can be used for repeat drug prescription appointments or like these things that definitely don't need an in-person appointment. And telemedicine is now just a factor in our lives. So I think the answer might be in the future with things like generative AI. It depends where we put it and it depends on the exact case. I think sweeping statements like perhaps I've been making relatively recently, like it should never be at the point of this. It should never be there. Like, yeah, those will get refined over time. And I think it will be a case of learning where they are. And I think the reason is the reason this has come up is because I think for all the benefit that you get of empathy with a human to human interaction, you have to then accept the drawback of perceived judgment. And I think that's the gap where this conversation has emerged from, which is what is the balance between the benefit of empathy versus the lack of then information you give to the therapist and the drawback therefore of perceived judgment and therefore the lack of benefit to that therapy that you then get there. So like, what's the trade-off? And I think that's a really interesting discussion. I think there should be lots more of this. And I hope that this leads to a place where we actually define, okay, well, we do have a shortage of therapists. We do have a shortage of, workers in mental health to deliver talking therapies. And so perhaps the conversation should now move on to a place of, okay, no broad sweeping statements, but what if we were to take some of these waiting lists away? What if we could take some of this demand and service it with an appropriate AI that was safe and was, clinically trialed and all these things, massive caveat being that it would need to be a medical device and all these things, which seem like we're not going to get over those hurdles anytime soon. But, you think 100, 200, 300 years in the future, what's things going to look like? It's not going to look the same, is it? So, my point the whole time has been that we should be having these conversations now and start to move to places where we can make this stuff more useful than it is now.
It's interesting you talk about judgment there. I think judgment is the thing that really came out in this article for me, is that you're looking at as you say, dozens of reasons almost that people prefer ChatGPT or generative AI as their therapeutic tool. And there are dozens of reasons, but you can boil most of them down to either the fear of being perceived to be judgmental or the fear of being judged. And it's such a, I'm sure it does, that this does cross over into other areas of healthcare, but I think it's probably sort of, most prominent in mental health, right? So I think one of the kind of things that interests me when you flip it to the other side and look at that the role of ChatGPT and the reasons people prefer ChatGPT rather than the reasons they don't like going to a therapist, is that, avoiding that judgment and avoiding other people judging them as well. And I think one of the things this article does very nicely is look at, balancing risk on that as well, because you may be avoiding the judgment of your therapist only for all of this to be attached to your name, your account, or anything else about you based on the results you give to generative AI, where your responses are going to be, far more linked to you going forward than your therapist's record or therapist's notes could ever be. And the risk is much higher of, these records, these notes being leaked in the future. I think it's odd to have a conversation about therapy and turn it to cybersecurity or, how big tech uses your data. But ultimately, there are conversations that do have to come in when we start talking about the role of generative AI and the role of tech in therapy and taking away that single human and introducing technology. So everyone's got to balance that personally, don't they? They've got to balance their personal risk appetite for each of these things and it could never happen to me. But we're seeing more and more it is happening. And these are challenges that we're going to have to talk about, particularly not just as we get into can we get these things registered as medical devices, which at the moment seems improbable, but no one can really see into the future. Would you want your information accessible to, ransomware providers or anything like that? It feels odd to go into a cybersecurity conversation while thinking this, but it's that kind of wider part of, there's nothing to prevent this information and that judgment that comes along with it happening in another form, in another arena further down the line, even if you choose to avoid the therapist.
I guess to play devil's advocate there a little bit, ChatGPT, for example, as a generative AI, has not been built for medical or health purposes in the same way that Google hasn't been built for medical or health purposes, yet you can still access medical and health information on there. Lots of people, doctors included, use Google, and other search engines are available, but search engines to maybe not have such a detailed conversation as they might with a generative AI, but still ask very leading questions about perhaps how they might be feeling in their state of mind and that kind of thing. And therefore that browser data, that browsing history, that search history is available and could also be leaked in a similar way to your ChatGPT conversation. And I do think that there probably is an element of, for example, with ChatGPT, if you're logging in, it feels a bit more private and it feels like you're having a conversation with someone, so you're more likely to open up. But there still is a huge amount of personal health information that is getting shared across other platforms, and other platforms that we wouldn't even consider getting them regulated as a medical device, because that isn't their intended use. It just so happens that people are using it to support their health. And I think that creates a really interesting conundrum for where where you do draw the line with regulation and I guess like medical devices, because I think where you have these kinds of tools and technologies, people are always going to be accessing them independently outside of like a traditional, I guess healthcare setting, or with the intention of it being like, I don't know, a Wobot, for example, because they'll be accessing it for so many different things. Like I would imagine that even someone using ChatGPT as a pseudo-therapist is probably also using it for like 100 other different things at the same time, in the same way that Google is as well. And I guess I don't think it's necessarily about regulation, but I do think you're right that it raises an important question about cybersecurity and data, because actually all of our data about us says so much about us. And, we've had conversations before about how, search engines and, big tech companies are able to almost diagnose people off their search history based on the questions that they're asking. And I would imagine that data is probably, relatively readily available. Perhaps by comparison, I'm not really sure, but I don't know. I'd like to think that information, I would assume that information was probably I would like to think that information was probably less protected than like my, I don't know, personal health records or whatever, where, I've given that information over to a doctor. But yeah, I just musing on that point, I don't know where you draw the line. And the other thing that really stood out to me is I can't believe how many people they said, on the study, they said 97% of people, and they surveyed, or they had a study group of 550 adult patients. Oh, and 93% said they lied to patients. But equally, I think it's worth saying that, as you said, James, like those lies are quite wide ranging, and some of them I wonder whether, like, some of them will obviously affect your therapy and your therapeutic outcome much more than others, and some of them seem almost not relevant to that. But I also don't know how you would go about like doing a comparative research study on the efficacy of an untrained ChatGPT model for therapy purposes versus a therapist. And
you're not getting that past ethics approval.
No, of course you're not. But and there's obviously interesting comparisons to draw with regards to lying. But I guess when you're thinking about improving outcomes and stuff, like instinctively you want to understand like how much does a person lying in therapy affect their therapeutic outcomes. And I guess you don't necessarily need to bring generative AI into that. But yeah, it just piqued my interest.
There's a balance as well, isn't there? It's, this article talks really in depth about ChatGPT, and we've seen a lot of stats about how people will, have been using ChatGPT to support their mental health outcomes when it's clearly not a medical device. We strongly recommend you don't use it for therapy. And in terms of the outcomes that it's going to be providing, as you said, it's going to be hard to work out the therapeutic outcomes of using ChatGPT and its success as an advisor. And I think in terms of therapeutic outcomes, you're basically, someone who is brutally honest to ChatGPT is probably getting nothing back from it, nothing therapeutically valuable back from it. It might get that kind of slight sense of empathy, sort of forced empathy that ChatGPT can bring in to it if you ask it to pretend to be a therapist, but you're not really getting any validated benefit back from it. I think on the flip side, we had a really great article in Pigeon while you were away, just on the chat, the sort of the role of generative AI in this, which is Wobot, James, that you've name checked already. Their tech team published a really exciting article, and I'd suggest go back and reading it if you haven't, about how they looked at using LLMs in their system and the work that they've been doing to bring it in. And obviously their system, their currently available product doesn't use generative AI, but they ended it with a sort of very optimistic point of there is absolutely a place for generative AI in their tool or in future tools. And I think at that point, the willingness to be brutally honest to Wobot and having combining generative AI into that could actually result in something possibly a lot more positive than fobbing off your therapist and going off to talk to ChatGPT, as this article seems to imply that lots of people are doing. So there could be some real value to be willing to be that honest when to generative AI when it's built into a system like Wobot or something, or other tools are available.
I think it's honestly, I think this stuff is fascinating because for whatever reason, I just think that this is the key to so much that might not be so obvious. I think there's so much AI can do, and the interface between AI and patients, if we just highlight that and do extra work around the nuances there, I think that is the interface where so much benefit can be achieved, rather than a blanket, no, it should never be there, or a blanket, like, yeah, we'll try it, and then something goes horribly wrong. Actually, just a really considered strategy to find out where does it fit, what are the small places it can fit that we can grow it out of. And there's just so much complexity there that if we just get this bit right, what are the benefits? How much does empathy play? Is synthetic cognitive empathy that AI can deliver enough for certain things? Is emotional empathy and cognitive empathy that only humans can do? Is where exactly should that go? And therefore, let's exclude AI from there and not bother trying and testing it. Let's actually now earmark that as pure human, and yeah, let's scale it across everything else. We can focus on that. Like this stuff, I think is the key to so much. The final thing I'll say on this is that someone called Lance Elliott with one L wrote this article, a contributor for Forbes, a world-renowned expert on AI, over 7.4 million amassed views on his AI columns. He's a tech entrepreneur, a CIO, a CTO, professor at UCS and UCLA, head of a pioneering AI labs, frequently speaks at AI industry events, been on CNN, all the rest of it. So this is someone who knows their stuff. Have a look at him on Forbes. He's got a lot of articles about generative AI, doomsday risk. A lot in here about this sort of work. So someone that's really pioneering this stuff.
And of particular interest to us, it seems like he's doing an ongoing series on the impact of generative AI in health and the medical space more broadly. So that's definitely one for us to keep an eye on. And I'm sure there'll be some interesting insights that we will be debating in future editions of Healthtech Pigeon.
One of his articles is about how generative AI is using his term, goosing people into believing they have a mental health problem when they don't.
Woo.
Another is about using AI to replace emotional support animals, but...
That's like, I was going to say, is that like having a Tamagotchi? Kind of.
A little bit.
Kind of.
Emotional support dogs are impossible to replace. They are the best.
Spoken from true personal experience. Well, it sounds like we could talk about this all day, and maybe we should just dedicate an episode to this series, because all of those articles sound incredibly interesting. But we must move on today and talk about a few other things. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but whenever I'm off for really any period of time, but in particular a long period of time, you always worry what you're coming back to. And we've been very lucky that we've come back to a well-oiled machine. The SomX ship is steaming forward and everything has been great. In fact, the team don't even need us. But in particular, it's really nice to come back to some good news. And the good news this week is a huge fundraise, a unusually huge fundraise from a neuromodulation newcomer, Amber Therapeutics, a medical device company specializing in urinary incontinence, and they have backed a cool $100 million Series A, which is reported to be one of the biggest Series A rounds ever in the UK and in Europe. that's exciting. And we've been talking, I mean, don't get me wrong, that there've been lots of raises that, cause for celebration. And, it's been a tough old time in the investment market and in VC land, particularly for our friends in healthcare and life sciences. So it is so encouraging to see this announcement. And I'm sure, that is the result of some real blood, sweat and tears to pull that off. But Hugh, you know a little bit more about the work that Amber are doing and everything that's gone into sealing the deal and getting ink on the dotted line. So tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, we were super excited to see this one at the beginning of this week. It's massive news and such just, it's a return on absolutely fantastic work by the team at Amber. So very, very quickly, they have a fantastic technology which essentially uses neuromodulation or bioelectrical stimulation of and we'll get really into the sciencey stuff now, of the pudendal nerve for the first time.
You're just showing off. Come on.
I know. It's the joy of having spent so much time with them, and it has been great fun to watch them get to this point as well. But essentially, just quoting from the Fierce Biotech, because I think they say it better than I can, the UK-based startup aims to be the first to offer a fully implantable therapy capable of addressing both stress and urge urinary incontinence, which includes the leaks that occur spontaneously during physical activity, as well as the onset of sudden uncontrollable impulses to go to the bathroom, also known as overactive bladder. So Amber have this fantastic technology, which is an implantable chip that essentially, they don't like to use the term, but is essentially closed loop in that they implant it onto the pudendal nerve and it senses and adapts to the patient's own nerve impulses and bladder, and helps regulate the way they helps regulate their bladder impulses, which is absolutely fantastic. They've got the implant, they've got the novel surgical method to actually implant it into the patient's body, and together they've got this. They work to build what is essentially an incredible therapy, answering a really quite significant unmet need. And I think they've already had some fantastic results from some initial studies they've done on an initial group to check that the surgical method is safe, to check that the implantation is safe. And I think the size of this raise just shows the kind of optimism that that investors have about this technology, about this therapy, and about this method. It's huge news. It's there's very little like this on the market, and I think they're set to be. This is only their Series A and they're set to be going places. So I think watch this space for Amber Therapeutics. It's going to be an interesting few years for them.
Yeah, they've really set the tone for how they mean to carry on. And if this is their Series A, I'm already excited to see how big their Series B is going to be. But I'm interested to understand, because obviously there are other neuromodulation devices for people with urinary incontinence available at the moment, and my understanding of it is that actually the efficacy is pretty mixed. It's not great at the moment. So what is it that Amber are doing differently that's kind of overcoming that efficacy barrier to make it more effective for people who are experiencing it? Because it is such it is something that it might seem really basic, but has such an impact on people's quality of life that I can imagine if you go through the experience of having a device implanted into you, and then, after a relatively short period of time, it kind of stops working. That can be probably frustrating and quite distressing. And I imagine you probably don't want to keep on a regular basis having to have those kind of maybe adjustments, interventions, or whatever it might be. So what are Amber doing differently?
Yeah, completely. So from my own understanding of having worked with a team, it's not the only neuromodulation system out there. What it's doing, however, that's completely different to others. Most of the other devices on the market essentially use something called sacral modulation, which is bioelectrical stimulation of the sacral nerve. It's a more, I guess it's a blunt instrument, if you will, for regulating physiological processes around the bladder. It's a blunt instrument for regulating physiological processes around the bladder. So what Amber are doing different? What's I guess the kind of sort of quiet, most interesting part of this is that they are looking at the pudendal nerve, which gives a lot greater, from the sounds of it, gives a lot more control. It's if the sacral nerve is the blunt instrument, then the pudendal nerve is essentially the controller of urinary and physiological function in the pelvic region. So that's what they're doing differently, and it sounds from the initial studies that it's working. So their initial study, which they announced in February of this year, was on 13 women in Belgium to demonstrate the feasibility of the procedure. 4 out of the 5 participants that completed the trial reported complete resolution of their mixed incontinence episodes. There's going to be more results coming towards the end of this year, but it's a novel method, it's a novel therapy, and I think we're probably going to see some very positive results toward the end of the year.
Yeah, for any medics listening, basically, pudendal nerve, S2 to S4. What the neuromodulation does is it innervates the external urethral sphincter. So instead of changing or neuromodulating, the bladder itself or the muscles around the bladder, you're literally just attacking the exit. So you just close the exit to the bladder. Therefore, that's why it gives you just so much control, which is different to techniques done before.
Oh, that is really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that evolves and getting closer to detail in the data as that becomes available, because it is something that affects so many people. And as you say, it's really interesting to see a precision alternative to a blunt or broad, should I say, broad spectrum solution. Yeah, awesome. A good effort to Amber and to Aidan and the Amber team, should I say. Lots of A's there. Whilst usually I love alliteration, in this instance, it's tripped me up a little bit. So yeah, congratulations, Amber Therapeutics. Excited to see what comes next. So our final story this week sees us flip all the way back to AI again. Not generative AI this time, but AI in the round. And it is a report that comes to us from Silicon Valley Bank, talking about the AI-powered healthcare experience, which is mapping the patient journey. Now, according to this report, investment in healthcare AI is actually growing more rapidly than investment into non-health AI, which, Pigeon is a bit competitive, always, particularly where raise and investments are concerned. So this is also music to our ears. But I'm interested to understand why healthcare AI has captured the attention of investors in particular.
So I'm only a little way through this report and, focusing most of my comments on what's on the landing page of the report and some of the interesting insights that Silicon Valley have pulled out. So I think Silicon Valley Bank have pulled out. But I think there's some very interesting data just on that page. I think it ties into quite a few of the stories that we're talking about in Pigeon this week, not least some of the stuff about global hospital execs and what they're investing in and what technologies they're actually putting into practice as part of their kind of commercial procurement and implementation plans around healthcare technology. But taking this right back to the beginning is, as you said, 1 in 4 healthcare VC dollars are invested in companies leveraging AI. So, people are interested in the role of AI. Not a massive shock if, the last couple of years of generative AI growth and expansion has been something. But what really stands out, particularly given a lot of the conversations we've had on this podcast over the last couple of years, investment in healthcare AI is growing at an extraordinary rate, and it's growing faster than it is for investment in AI for other sectors. And as you said, Jess, take that fintech. When competition comes in, we're always very happy to see that health is right at the top. But, and obviously, for me, the immediate response is why? Because obviously there's going to be a huge potential impact of AI in healthcare, but we're seeing so many examples, particularly if generative AI is pushing this forward. And if we look at the charts, generative AI is definitely pushing this forward in health, in other sectors. Wherever you're looking, it's going to be generative AI that's driving this forward, and every company is wanting to be in some way generative AI at the moment, and it's potentially probably getting a little tedious for some investors. But if we can't use generative AI yet, or the regulatory barriers to generative AI in healthcare are too strong to see the big return, yes, healthcare is always the long-term investment. It's the long-term play for investors in a way that some other sectors you see faster results over a shorter time with higher returns. So why is healthcare AI growing so much faster? Why is it so interesting to investors? That's the question that I can't work out.
I think it's because humans are inherently good, and young people, particularly Gen Z, Gen X, and back end of millennials, that are the ones probably thinking of these ideas and raising money. They want careers of purpose, and they're the ones that are probably most over this AI boom in terms of perhaps slightly more naive thinking, or just the generation of those ideas. But if you're university, post-university right now, and you're thinking, well, how do I create a life and a career of purpose? And hey, I've been learning about AI in my computer science degree and I know loads, then maybe your mind just straight away goes to healthcare as a way of generating those ideas, and enough of that happens, and therefore the most amount of ideas goes into healthcare, and most amount of investments. Maybe it's something to do with that, or maybe that's at least a factor. That's me wanting to I don't know, see the world with rose-tinted glasses, maybe, rather than looking at any potential financial impact or gain of the individual. But I think that's probably true to some extent, that I'd like to believe it anyway, that humans are inherently good, and their mind goes to thinking about how to create purpose with this technology, and that's where healthcare comes in.
Do we think then that investors are seeing all of these great ideas, seeing all of these people with purpose, and thinking, okay, health AI is the long-term play in health. It's something we can invest in, and we will eventually overcome these hurdles. We're seeing opportunities to, I guess, shift that whatever burdens and barriers to actually using these tools and actually getting revenue from them. We're seeing the opportunity to shift that, some of the responsibility, some of the challenges, to another space. So, when it comes to using AI, putting that, I guess, regulatory burden on the clinician rather than the AI is quite often how a lot of the ones we're seeing do it. But maybe I'll extend my argument to also, humans are inherently good, and investors can choose to put their money wherever they want. And actually, maybe it's the investors too that think the biggest delta, I'm talking in, I guess, very broad, higher level strokes here, but maybe as a whole, that you're seeing a very international population level. You're seeing the fact that humans are inherently good and want to improve healthcare, and that's why that number spikes. I don't know. There's probably a lot more better reasons for it, but I don't know. Maybe it's that, along with, there is a huge delta, isn't there? Like where healthcare is currently. In fact, recorded a podcast yesterday with Dimitri Tran, the founder of Harrison.ai. Huge, in 40 countries. They've deployed AI across radiology, pathology, loads of different places. And I asked him the question, how do patients perceive the boom in large language models? I didn't ask him about patients. I asked him, how has he seen has the phone been ringing off the hook since large language model boom happened? Like, people are a lot more comfortable with AI now. Is he getting more customers? And he actually said the biggest swell has been with patients that have started asking if AI is involved, because they're now perceiving AI plus human is better than just human. So they're asking, is AI involved in this? Because he was saying that patients are going into these massive CT and MRI scanners. There's screens everywhere where the radiologists and they're looking at all these screens and all this tech and blah, blah, blah. And he said they did a survey
of like, how do you feel about AI being involved? And the most common white space answer in the sort of other section was, I thought AI was involved anyway. And so there's almost this swell of like, we've got all this technology in healthcare, but absolutely no AI in some of these places where it's expected that it is. I think that's the thing. The gap between where we are in healthcare and where we could be with AI is so enormous that perhaps as an investor, that is where you want to take a gamble. And it is a gamble. Early stage investing is a gamble. It's all gambling. But maybe if you're at the roulette table and, you know, you can pick between 30 numbers, but for these 3 numbers over here, you get way better odds, even though the chance of it being successful is exactly the same. Well, maybe you just put it on those 3 numbers because why not? Maybe that's what healthcare is. It's like, well, it might struggle in a lot of different places, but actually at least here we'll get disproportionate returns for the amount of impact it will make. I don't know. I'm speculating, but
to be really reductive about it, do we also not think that there's an element of like healthcare is in crisis and that we know that there are huge issues in healthcare that can't be solved by people because there aren't enough of them? And so our next best option is going to be technology, ergo AI and that kind of thing. And therefore they're seeing the need to, or seeing the benefit of perhaps investing in that early on, because in the next 5 to 10 years, those technologies are going to be playing a bigger part in the way that healthcare is delivered and solving those problems and bridging those gaps. Because as we know, like, and we've talked about extensively, AI technology is not here to take the role of clinicians. It's to solve the gaps that are there and to allow clinicians to do the jobs that they signed up to do. So I also wonder whether there is that kind of like pragmatic forward look about there's some big issues here that do need to be solved, and these could be some of the solutions to actually doing that.
Just wanted to be the person who invested in Apple in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, I think that is a great place to wrap up. And James and I are especially excited because we are heading off to the very first Health Europe next week in Amsterdam. So we are looking forward to listening to the DJs, going on the 5K run, seeing the muppies. My understanding is the mental health puppies, the emotional support dogs, and obviously all the amazing speakers that they've got. So I'm looking forward to reporting back. So we'll be notably absent again next week, I'm sure. Unless we're not. Maybe we won't be. Maybe we'll be back in time to record it. But we're hoping to get some interesting sound bites and interviews while we're over there. So stay tuned and we'll give you the download. And in the meantime, see everybody else next week.